I want to start with a disclaimer by saying again that I'm not speaking as a disabled person, and I certainly don't pretend to speak on behalf of disabled people. I'm speaking as a carer to a terminally ill parent with life-limiting disabilities, a theologian having studied this for more than a decade, and a researcher working with and learning from people with disabilities and those who love them. I also want to say that there are as many disabilities as there are disabled people, and so I can't possibly pretend to cover all of disability in my talk. My family has had a very specific and quite traumatic experience of disability, and even within our own nuclear family, the experience of living with and caring for our parents is quite different between me and my sibling, so I'm not even speaking on behalf of my family. When I was in my mid-teens, after a quick but complex health situation, one of my parents suffered a life-changing brain injury, which at first manifested itself as small changes not uncommon to anyone of a certain age or under a lot of stress, but which over the years developed into a completely different experience of the body and mind to what we had known before, until they needed constant care and supervision, being in bed most of the time from last year until they died fairly peacefully in May this year. For their privacy and for that of my immediate family, I'm not going to specify any more right now, but I did want to share this background of my research because, as we'll get a chance to discuss in the breakout rooms, it naturally colours my thinking around all of this. For me, disability and terminal illness have been devastatingly cruel and painful things, matched only by the resilience, the grace, and the love of my parents throughout their illness. This is not the case for everyone. Not everyone has a negative experience with disability, and not everyone has the positive family relationships I am fortunate to have. As we'll see throughout the evening, there's a wonderful, strong, positive voice from disabled people and disability activists who rightly have an overall constructive relationship with their bodies, and who, though facing very real health and access issues, generally have positive connotations with the word disabled. These people often prefer the term disabled people, not seeing disability as a negative term, but a positive or maybe neutral one, which they're happy to claim and identify themselves with. Equally, others prefer the term people with disabilities to emphasize that they are not fully defined by their disabilities or health, but are people first and foremost. In my experience, both phrases are completely valid and make total sense, so I'm going to try and use both throughout the evening in a bid to include as many experiences as possible. So before I continue on with what I have to say, we're going to watch a short film from my interviewees who have been telling me a bit about their experiences.
Hello everybody, my name is Hayden Spenceley. I'm a Church of England minister. I'm also a wheelchair user who has cerebral palsy. It's great to be sharing briefly with you at Listening Well, and I hope you have a wonderful time sharing all together. In answer to the question, how has my disability impacted my faith, and how has my faith impacted how I view my disability, it does come down to listening. We live in a world that isn't very happy to listen to the stories and the voices of marginalized people, but God listens to me. He knows me. God is the only one I've ever met who truly, really passionately wants me to participate in the work of the kingdom, including the fact that I have these impairments, these parts of my body that don't do what other people wish they would do, and sometimes what I wish they would do too. God values me, broken, malfunctioning bits and all, as well as the strengths that I have that only really I could have because of having cerebral palsy and living the life that I have. The church is impoverished when it doesn't listen to the voices of impaired and disabled people. Society is impoverished when it doesn't listen to the voices of impaired and disabled people and invite them to participate fully. The church has the opportunity to set a tone for impaired and disabled people to participate fully at every level. I wish we would just get on with it.
So I'm profoundly deaf and have worn hearing aids for most of my life. I recently got a cochlear implant, which has made a really big difference in terms of how much I can hear. But I think for me, disability is simply a different way of experiencing the body. You might be experiencing slightly more downsides than the average person, but there are upsides as well. And I think any effort towards inclusion needs to acknowledge the value of those different experiences and the way people are experiencing the world in different ways, because I think they can enrich our experience as humanity as a whole, in understanding all of these different perspectives. In terms of what I'd like people to know about my life, I think that just because I can hear more now with a cochlear implant, my life is easier, but easier isn't necessarily the same thing as better. I think that a life without friction or perhaps challenges or problem solving is actually a life that's quite unfulfilling. And I think that having the opportunity to see what I'm truly capable of in the face of what many people might consider disadvantages has actually been enormously beneficial. I think disability affects my faith in that it really brings things into focus, and it highlights how little I can really do with my own abilities. And the limitations that I face every day make me rely more on God, and I'm more aware of how much I need him. I also think that when you're aware of how wrong things can go for you and how hard your life has the potential to be, you are that much more grateful for when things are going well, and you really experience your life as a gift.
Hi, I'm Tom Shakespeare, and I'm a sort of Quaker Anglican you could call it. And the disability message that I get, particularly from the Bible, in the book of Hebrews, it says, "Make a level path for my feet, so that the lame be not disabled." And to me, that's saying, don't put barriers in our way. Remove the impediments, the steps, the stairs, which make it difficult for us to be included. And the other great gospel message that appeals to me in particular is the parable of the great feast, where the host goes out, sends his servants out into the streets to pick up the poor, the lame, the homeless, and to welcome them. And that's very much what the Christian welcome is about. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone has that of God in them. Everybody is welcome. Let's remove the barriers and make a genuine welcome to everyone.
The support that we had from the wider world was really patchy, and that was really harder than helping Dad. And that caused so much more pain and humiliation to Dad and to us as a family than we already had. And from family and friends, we were dropped by a lot of people who felt that they couldn't cope with Dad dribbling or Dad looking different. Some people actually said it outright and said they didn't want to come and visit us. And some people just dropped us off their radar. And that's really hard. I would like society to know that disability is part of life and should not be relegated to the sidelines, just to care homes. We can't Hollywoodize life and make it look pretty and Instagrammable, and that disabled people are part of our lives and should be included as such. It's an incredibly lonely experience as a carer. I can't imagine what it's like as a disabled person to be in an institution where you're treated as other. So inclusivity, but not just on a philosophical level, which is now enshrined in law and the Disability Act, but actually on a physical level, which actually changes people's lives.
I spent about 10 years on and off as an unpaid caregiver for a family member with a disability. That time really opened my eyes to how lucky he was to have access to healthcare and a large community support network, but also that many do not have this. And so that full inclusion and access and care itself is predicated on a social fabric that accounts for people who are on the margins and need more support or different support than what the majority already receives. With regards to my faith, it helped me to understand that faith can only be lived as a daily practice, that it's not something one time, it's not a one-off big picture thing, but it's a daily process, just like access. Healthcare is great, but it doesn't really matter if you can't get out of your house, if you don't have accessible transportation, if the sidewalks and pavements aren't accessible as well, if the building itself isn't accessible. It's an everyday, all the time, constant need. And that actually was really helpful and fruitful for my own faith experience, to realize that that's also the way we're called to live in this world.
Hello, my name's Rachel, and this is my daughter Betsy, who is 3 years old. Betsy has Down syndrome. What are our lives like? I'm full-time carer for Betsy. We have a very busy, active, rich life. Betsy has a million hobbies. Having a child with Down syndrome is like having a child. Yep. Like with any child, it comes with its challenges and ups and downs. And we just make the most of our lives and enjoy every day. Betsy helps with that. She teaches us how to do that. Don't you? Yep. Aww. So our lives are full of love and happiness. In terms of my faith, if anything, it has made me more grateful. Betsy's birth was quite a challenging experience due to a number of health complications. So I'm just essentially extremely grateful that she is here and that she is living her life every day with me. So thank you for listening to us. Are you going to say bye-bye?
Bye.
Bye.
Great. So thank you to Hayden, Christy, Tom, Sophie, Toph and Rachel for your beautiful and diverse and lovely contributions. So let's get into some theology then. What is disability theology? One of Britain's leading theologians working today is Professor John Swinton. There he is in the corner, looking nice and smiley. He is Chair in Divinity and Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen. He's a registered mental health nurse and a registered nurse for people with learning disabilities, and he's particularly well placed to research and practice in disability theology. And I'm not just saying that because I think he might be here this evening. He's also an incredibly intuitive and decent person. He describes disability theology as the attempt by disabled and non-disabled Christians to understand and interpret the gospel of Jesus Christ, God, and humanity against the backdrop of the historical and contemporary experiences of people with disabilities. It has come to refer to a variety of perspectives and methods designed to give voice to the rich and diverse theological meanings of the human experience of disability. In his article, Who is the God We Worship? Theologies of Disability, Challenges and New Possibilities, Swinton recognises that people with disabilities have been at best a minority voice in Christian theology and practice, and at worst have been completely silenced. In listening to such voices and reflecting on the life experiences of people with disabilities, it hopes to rethink and recalibrate aspects of theology and practice that serve to exclude or misrepresent the human experience of disability. And I would add, serves to expand and add texture to what we understand that it is to be human. And this is what I hope we can share together this evening. As an area of research, disability theology has a strong connection to secular disability studies, anthropology and sociology, and it is as varied as the experiences of those working in it and the people they love. In his article, John lays out some major themes which take us on a whistle-stop tour of the genre and the different ways they can help us perceive God. So firstly, we see God as disabled himself, God as accessible, God as limited, God as vulnerable, God as giver and receiver. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on each one. One of the key texts in this area is Nancy Iceland's book, The Disabled God. Iceland is a sociologist with a severe physical disability, and she writes of an epiphany which bore little resemblance to the God I was expecting or the God of my dreams. I saw God in a sit-puff wheelchair, that is, the chair used mostly by quadriplegics, enabling them to maneuver by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. In this moment, I beheld God as a survivor, unpitying and forthright. I recognized the incarnate Christ in the image of those judged not feasible, unemployable, and with questionable quality of life. Here was God for me. She considers the risen wounds of Christ in Luke 24, when the disciples are invited to touch the scars of his crucifixion, and she argues that this shows a form of disability being incorporated into the divine, literally made part of the body of God in Jesus. For Iceland, disability does not only not contradict the human divine integrity, it becomes a whole new model of wholeness and a symbol of solidarity. Another key text that Swinton highlights is Copious Hosting by Jenny Weiss-Block, which speaks of the accessibility of relationship with God. A lay Dominican and practical theologian, like me, Weiss-Block is not disabled, but has a family member who is. She brings theology and secular disability studies into conversation, and in Copious Hosting, she considers how sometimes in the Gospels Jesus was guest and sometimes he was a host. In the same way, Weiss-Block talks about co-hosts, a community where each member both gives and receives, are considered equally important and with equal capacity to teach and to learn, instead of the common practice of people with disabilities only ever being seen as guests, only ever the person in need, not as having an agency of their own. Sam Wells, vicar of St Martin's in the Field in London, writes similarly on the importance of doing things with, alongside people experiencing homelessness, rather than a traditional top-down charitable model with the assumption that we know best, have all the agency, and they can only receive rather than teach us anything. This is something that the large community does so well and speaks to something of what both Tom and Sophie were saying in their videos. Next, there's Deborah Creamer's frank appraisal of the limits or otherwise which disability presents and how this affects who God is. She's a systematic theologian and a feminist scholar, and she argues that the limits experienced by people with disabilities are just one example of the overall limited condition of all human beings. She distinguishes between limits and limitations. People are only as disabled, according to her, as their surroundings are not adapted to help them. In disability studies, it is not the condition which makes someone disabled as how maladapted or otherwise are their surroundings and their community, as both Topher and Sophie spoke about. As Creamer says, our limits need not and perhaps ought not to be seen as negative, but rather they are an important part of being human. Nowadays, with the progress being made all the time in medical science, we expect full health all the time. Yet disability can be just, as Christie says, a different way of experiencing the body, which former generations may have been more accepting of than we are today. Fourthly, theologian Tom Reynolds emphasizes how the lives of disabled people mirror God's love for creation and a divine vulnerability in creation. As Swinton puts it, vulnerable love that God embraces in Christ, entering fully into the frailty of the human condition, even unto a tragic death. Reynolds writes, sharing the divine self in this way sends a distinct message. God is in solidarity with humanity at its most fundamental level, in weakness and in brokenness. This is not to romanticize weakness. Rather, here God reveals the divine nature as compassion, not only by undergoing or suffering with human vulnerability, but also by raising it up into God's own being. When we realize that we are all vulnerable, the possibility of welcoming people with disabilities into relationships which are marked by mutual vulnerabilities and care becomes an option. Once again, we discover that there is nothing qualitatively different about the lives of people with disabilities. Rather, the vulnerability of disability is revelatory of the nature of human beings and of God. As Swinton says, human beings are simply varied and loved. And as a friend of mine used to say, when I lamented the strain dealing with my parents' illness had put on my family and our relationships, he said, "Plender, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is." And for some reason, I found that immensely freeing. Lastly, Swinton tells us about ethicist and theologian Stanley Hauerwas and how he sees God as a giver and receiver, how we can have a reciprocal relationship with God through the prism of the lives of people with disabilities, particularly those Hauerwas focuses on with profound intellectual disabilities. That is, people who have no speech and are assumed to have little ability to process the intellectual aspects of faith. In the mutual relationships in the Trinity between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, what theologians often call the perichoresis, or eternal circular dance between the three persons of the Trinity, we see that perfection, the ultimate in being alive and real, fully existing, is not about independence, power, and transcendence. Hauerwas writes that love and not transcendence, giving and not being superior, are qualities that mark God's divinity. Love and dependence are aspects of perfection, both divine and human. That is why, in the face of disabled people, we are offered an opportunity to see God, for like God, they offer us an opportunity of recognizing the character of our neediness. In truth, disabled people in this respect are but an instance of the capacity we each have for one another. That they are singled out is only an indication of how they can serve for all of us as a prophetic sign of our true nature as creatures destined to need God and thus one another. Moreover, it is through such recognition that we learn how God would have the world governed. In this light, for Hauerwas, like Reynolds, disability as a philosophical category, a definition of being a person, almost doesn't exist. It just looks like one, under the gaze of modernity's ableist and capitalist expectations. And the Church has a special responsibility to be a prophetic example of where reciprocal relationships and mutual flourishing can be lived out and come to life, how God would have the world governed, or to put it another way, in ushering in the kingdom of God. What does the Bible say about disability and caring, then? Well, I can't possibly sum up disability throughout the whole Bible in one sitting, but let me share some key texts which have shaped my thinking and my feeling around all of this. Firstly, the priests and the Levitical laws in the Pentateuch in the Old Testament. Leviticus 21:17 says that no man among your descendants who has a physical defect is to come and present the food of his God to act as priest. Whether a blind man, a lame man, a man stunted or overgrown, a man deformed in foot or hand, and it goes on. Mary Douglas, in her book Purity and Danger, suggests that for the ancient Israelites, any form of disability rendered someone, including priests or especially priests, as imperfect, representing a movement away from God-given created life towards an unclean death, moving a person ritually away from the life that is associated with God's creative power. What this means in actuality is that disabled people were rejected and excluded from full participation from worship and society from the very beginning of the Bible. There are various cultural reasons this will have been for, but I do want to acknowledge that at the start, that as Hayden put it, it has always seemed that disabled people are not welcome to lead worship and to lead their communities. Yet, on the other hand, we see God himself choosing individuals with disabilities to bear his kingdom and to do his work. In Exodus 4, we read about Moses' speech impediment, with Aaron effectively as his carer or translator. Paul's thorn in the flesh is widely speculated about. Mental illness, poor eyesight, his sexuality, a particular person he found difficult, or epilepsy are all theorized about as could have been his thorn. But in any case, it does seem to have been an issue problematic enough to have a significant effect on how he went about his life and ministry. And yet, like the stuttering Moses before him, he was called to give the law, imperfections and all. The paradox about all of this is summed up in 1 Samuel 16. where we're told that God looks on the man looks at the outside appearances, where God looks at the heart. Which this throws us back to what Tom Reynolds was saying and his interpretation of the vulnerability of God, or as Swinton puts it, humans being simply varied and loved and not reducible to their physicality. Man looks at the outside and God looks at the heart. Then in the healing at Bethesda in John 5, for me, what is most remarkable about this story is the length of time that the man in it had waited. We're told that there was a pool called Bethesda or Sheepgate, which always makes me think of sheep dipping, but that's not the point. And we're told that people were healed when an angel stirred up the waters of the pool by which this man had lain. But as he had no one to help him to the edge, he was isolated and alone. This man had waited almost 40 years for his healing. Then when he meets Jesus, Jesus doesn't even heal him instantly, as he does with, say, the woman with the issue of blood, but he enters into conversation with him. First, he asks him if he wants to be well. How agonizing, frustrating, depressing must it have been for this man to lie there watching others who arrived after him being healed before him by the pool. But then he meets the one who made the pool and is healed not by a thermal spring, but by the spring of life in Christ. He walks out of Bethesda's colonnades and into the pages of Scripture. The healing that he waited for so long, when he had given up hope, is the one we are told about, not the countless others which he had watched happen before him. And lastly, for the moment, widows and orphans in James 1. As with the golden commandment of loving others as we love ourselves, this is not a non-negotiable in the lives of our faith communities. The care we are called to offer to the most vulnerable among us, which in first century Palestine were the widows and orphans without a husband or father to provide for them. And that would now include some disabled people, along with the elderly, migrants, or homeless people. I want to speak now particularly to those of us here who are not disabled or who don't have first-hand long-term experience of disability. Why should we care about this? Why is disability theology important for the church and the wider world? Because it tells us about who we are and who God is. For those here tonight who don't have a faith background, or if you do, but you're considering how to talk about your faith well, there is so much richness and rest to be found in how we view humanity through the prism of disability theology. It's also important because it's legal. The Equality Act of 2010 legally protects people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society, directly, indirectly, by harassment or victimization. If you have a business, a charity, service users, or a church, and you do not meet the needs of people with disabilities, you are open to prosecution. The church has a responsibility to demonstrate God's love for the world and at the very least to stop harming people. We need our churches to be able to welcome everyone to encounter the love and the hope that God brings. As John Swinton puts it, in the present, love without rights leaves people vulnerable to the fallout from human sinfulness. My family were told time and again, and one time explicitly, we don't do disabled here, when we went to a pub which didn't have a ramp and we weren't allowed to go in. Saying we don't do disabled, either in thought, word, or deed, is completely unacceptable. Secondly, more cheerfully, it's loving. We're called to look after the widows and orphans, to do justice, to love our neighbour. If we are not caring about people who look different to us, or who don't look different to us, might feel different on the inside, we're missing something of the heart of God. In Romans 14, Paul warns us of being a stumbling block to others. In the youth groups I grew up in, a stumbling block was mainly what girls were to hormonal boys. But Paul is writing less about purity culture and visible bra straps, and more about making a way to include all in relationship with God, smoothing their way, as Tom said in his video. Most importantly, it's life-giving. It brings you into fuller relationship with that person who will teach you. You will learn about God and life, and the whole spectrum of life in all its fullness and diversity, in every colour and shade. I'm well aware that I have learnt lessons about love, life, and faith, and myself, as a young carer, which I might never have learned had my parent been well. So what are these? The foremost and biggest lesson I have learned and continue to learn is that we are created for interdependence, for community. Anthropologists tell us of the importance of the tribe system for the development of humanity across the world. And way back in Genesis 2, God looks at Adam and speaks over all creation that it is not good to be alone, so creates a companion in Eve. Notably, the Hebrew word we translate in the King James Bible as helpmeet is ezer, and it used in its Greek form paraclete to describe the Holy Spirit in, for instance, John 14:26. This is the significance of Eve to Adam and of our people, our tribe to us. This is something we can all relate to of late, with the loneliness and the longing of lockdown and the distance that has had to force between us and our usual loved ones. I'm an introvert. I recharge through time spent processing and resting quietly on my own. And I do worry about the tropes of needy women from 90s rom-coms. But I have watched how delighted our family has been to care for my parents throughout their condition, how meaningful those relationships have been, how much we loved them, whether or not my ill parent was providing for us or not, whether they have needed us or not. Needing others to help you is not needy. It is natural, and it's an intended part of our created identity. We have to be careful of idolizing independence. It can so easily slip into isolation. Independence is, of course, crucial for people with disabilities in any way that they need. Assisted living, mobility aids, things like that are vital. But it is not a failure to lean on others, particularly for those with acquired disabilities and to those who are able-bodied but worry too much about asking too much of their friends. I want to say, it is not a coincidence that Adam and Eve, surely, whether you take them as literally or as a metaphor, and Jesus, literally the fullest and most alive of all humanity ever, they lived in relationship and in community. Jesus has his 12 plus all the other followers, which my flatmate once said was the greatest miracle Jesus ever did was having 12 close friends in his 30s, which I could definitely relate to. Whatever our physical state is, our emotional state, we are allowed to ask of others. If they can't give us what we need, that can be beyond heartbreaking. And if you have been in that situation, I want to say, like people do on Twitter, I see you, and I appreciate the devastation that asking for help and being rejected can bring. But we are allowed to ask again or ask someone else. Prayer and healing and everything is all well and good, and God definitely meets us himself. I'm not denying that for a second, but he also meets us through people. As John Swinton says, dependency, not autonomy, is one of the ontological characters of our lives, one of the essential characteristics of our lives. Secondly, we are not loved for our output. Watching my parents suffer and also thrive as they lived with their illness, I've considered again and again why we loved them, what made them lovable, and what love really is. As Cicely Saunders, founder of the modern hospice movement, puts it, you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die, which is a mantra for all of us, whatever our physical state. After I finished my master's at Christmas a few years ago and waited for my job to start the following August, I stayed on in Edinburgh, where I'd been at university, holding on to my independence and trying to boost my CV. I was unemployed, bored, lonely, and scared. And though I also did lovely things like dog walking, some press work, floristry, and worked as a research assistant, I was still worried. I texted a wise vicar friend saying I was struggling to work out who I was and what I was without studying and without caring for my family or being busy and productive. And they replied back in capital letters, beloved is what you are, whether or not you're being busy and productive. I clung to this as a life ring, and it expanded to a dinghy as I watched my parent in the sea of their illness and how much I loved them. I and my family loved them just as much when they were in a wheelchair, trussed up in a hoist or in a hospital bed, as when they were marching around the fields near our home or telling us about the world over supper? Are we not also loved, and more importantly, lovable, on those days when there are all too many of at the moment, when it's difficult to get out of bed and we spend nights or mornings or afternoons or all three staring at the wall and wondering what to do with ourselves? Beloved is what we are, whether or not we're being busy and productive. Which leads me to my next point. Disability is not the end of the world. Exclusion, loneliness, physical and mental pain, humiliation, dealing with care providers, trying to get an appointment with your GP, trying to find somewhere wheelchair accessible in the Isle of Wight in the rain, these are all things to be afraid of. Disability in itself is not something to be pitied, but supported where it's needed, or just left alone to get on with its life. This tweet from Tom is really helpful to remind us of the richness of the lives of people with disabilities. In all this, we have to be really alert to ableist thinking, to be mindful of idolizing intellect and reason, the prized assets of liberal society, as John Sinton puts it, in assuming that a life in a wheelchair with a walking stick or an assistance dog or whatever it might be is less than one's without. I'm thinking particularly of that genre of films from Me Before You to $1 Million Baby, which seem to portray life after a life-changing injury as a fate worse than death. We don't want to get into the euthanasia debate right now. It's a hugely complex and fraught conversation. But I will just say that articles I have read by well-known journalists in mainstream papers and casual comments from my friends and people I've met at parties with no immediate experience of acquired or terminal illness, people saying things like, I'd rather go to Switzerland than end up dribbling in a chair, or we put dogs to sleep, why can't we treat humans the same? The principle that any kind of diminished ability or independence would be so unbearable and meaningless to make ending life a better option is wholly offensive and hurtful to people actually living with acquired or lifelong disabilities and the people who love them. And I think it's a really dangerous example of liberalism taken to a pernicious extreme, prioritizing independence above all else. Which is to my next point. People experiencing hardship deserve to be cherished. Disabled people and carers were experiencing trauma before it was mainstream in 2020. I think this tweet from Becky McCoy, a writer and speaker who's had more than her fair share of trauma, sums it up really well. One thing I found extra hard this year is the lack of support my family have been able to count on from friends who naturally and not unreasonably have turned inwards to focus on their own immediate bubbles throughout COVID. As a church, we have to love the bereaved and carers well. Don't be those people who Sophie talked about who can't cope with a bit of spit. People don't bat an eyelid at babies' bodily functions, but the profoundly ill remind us of our mortality, so people are far more squeamish about an adult needing incontinence pads or help swallowing. Don't be. It's not sacred spit, as a relative once tried to reassure me when my ill parent accidentally dribbled on my clean jumper as I hugged them and I was annoyed. It's neither sacred nor unclean in the biblical sense. It's just spit, neutral and normal. So, commiserate the way you celebrate. My friend's mother says this, and I'm all for it. When someone gets engaged, we share a bottle of champagne. When babies are born, we send presents. Why not when we have a breakup or a bereavement too? Sure, we send flowers and cards to bereaved people, but that usually fades out after the funeral. Flora Gill, the daughter of food critic A.A. Gill, has spoken about how she wished she could do a gift list after her father's death when she had her eye on designer shoes. People encountering difficulties deserve as much attention and support more than people who've just marked a joyful, chosen life event. Duty and responsibility is a thing, and it's a thing that we're called to do. Be supportive of people who feel they have a duty to their family. Don't nag them towards self-care if we're not able to childmind for them while they do. I'm aware that for many disabled people, this might be patronising, as if they are a special case who need all the help they can get. And I want to say again here that I'm speaking as someone who's lived amongst death and degenerative illness for a decade. And I've seen again and again how much easier it is for people to celebrate an engagement or a birth or any other chosen positive life event than it is to celebrate the unchosen hardships of normal life. I'm all for celebrating the good things, just wish we could be better at commiserating too. So, How can the church respond? Physically, through preaching and language, and pastorally. Firstly, physically. Let's make sure people with disabilities can physically get into your building when we're allowed to gather again, and to use the loo when they're there. As Toph says, healthcare is all very well, but if you can't get there, it's void. There are lots of factors around this, but I've been really pleased to see Justin Welby talking about how much more important accessibility is than heritage. Sympathetic architecture is important, but it's also important to remember that churches and historic buildings have always been adapted. Most modern pews are Victorian, most whitewashed church walls are pre-Reformation, post-Reformation. Saying you can't welcome people in wheelchairs through too narrow 18th century doors, my family have been told, is not good enough. A disabled loo, which can only be reached by stairs, as at one office I worked at, is not good enough, and is definitely against the spirit of the Equality Act. A brilliant example of some integrative and inclusive architecture is the new ramp that's going to come at St Paul's Cathedral. It's taken over 20 years of planning, but as the Dean said, will provide an equal and easy way for wheelchair users and others into the front of the building like everyone else, not round the side like an afterthought. It's attractive and elegant and sympathetic to Wren's magnificent design, and it would be great to see this copied, albeit on a smaller scale, across our communities. If you need more help thinking about how to make your space accessible, the website and charity Livability have some great resources here. Language and preaching. It should, but doesn't, go without saying that we as Christians should use inclusive language and work to educate ourselves on non-offensive terminology. Read books and articles and have conversations with people to see how they prefer to be described. Keep in mind the needs of your congregations if you're leading a church service or a meeting, and instead of requesting that people stand, consider phrasing it as an invitation rather than a command. What takes a little more care is the subtext of our assumptions too. We should be careful about saying things like "be blessed" to people, as if it is up to us to manufacture our own blessing, rather than as a prayer that God will. We have to be careful around prosperity gospel type approaches to healing, and very careful when we pray with others for their healing. And it's vital that we watch how we talk about restrictions and those shielding during COVID, and bear in mind that the vulnerable among us can feel at least as much of an inconvenience already than the logistical challenge they might present to our meeting for worship, for instance. Let's do our best always not to exclude them, either in thought, word, or deed, as we navigate through life with COVID at the moment. Which leads me on to my final point, pastorally. The importance of good pastoral care and all the time, everyday practice, as Toph put it. We have to prioritize compassion. As Sophie said in her longer video, show up for people. Keep remembering them 7 times 77 times, not just when the baby is born, not just when they get a diagnosis, not just when there's an accident, not just when someone dies, but 7 times 77 all the time, every day. Well, maybe not all the time, every day, sort of within boundaries. And remember that love and compassion and a fight for justice take many forms. Anger in compassion makes it a force for change, as one of my interviewees said to me. By being here and part of tonight's conversation, you are making a start. We're all making a start together. And as Hayden said, let's just get on with it. Thank you.
I'd love to turn to Amy because we've had a few questions come through to you before we go to our final breakout room. So firstly, as we can see, actually, I think there's one above there. This one's been upvoted the most, so it's rising to the top of the pile. As a disabled person, how do I confront genuine issues without sounding bitter?
Oh, good question. I don't know if this person means in handling conflict or in talking about themselves. But I think my answer would be the same for either. I think honesty is really important, and also I think anger is really underrated. I definitely struggle with anger, and I don't like feeling it. I don't find it physically comfortable. I can deal with feeling sad. I know what soothes me when I'm sad, but when I'm angry, I don't really know. And I think disabled people and their families have a lot to be angry about. And they also, like women in the workplace, often get shut down if they're angry, and it's seen as antisocial, or you can end up feeling really patronized by expressing your anger. So I really, definitely really sympathize with this person. And I would say you probably have a lot to be bitter about. If you're feeling bitter, that's probably valid. So I think look into lament. I don't know if you're into, if you find reading or watching sermons on YouTube may be helpful, but lament is important. And I think, as we saw with that tweet from Becky McCoy earlier, if there's one benefit of 2020, it might be that the rest of society learns a little bit more about suffering and lament that lots of us here will already know about. So I would say to this person, confront it with boldness and notice when you're feeling bitter. Give yourself permission to feel bitter and to feel angry. I'm sure you will have coping mechanisms with anger and in confrontation that suit you and your personal situation. There's all the things like taking a deep breath, or writing down what you want to say first, or writing an email or a letter rather than doing something face to face. But yeah, I would say respect your bitterness, give yourself time to do that, and validate yourself. You're probably bitter for a reason, and that's okay.
Great, thanks. Well, that's answered. Next. So how do notions of God's limitations square with classical notions of, so kind of more sort of classically theological views of God as omnipotent?
Yes, good question. This is, I think the way I find it most helpful, and definitely talking about God as limited as a heading in that list of 5 headings at the slide at the beginning, definitely it's quite shocking. And for those of us who've been brought up in the church and very used to feeling, oh, God is all powerful, all knowing and all loving. So I don't mean to do a rude voice. He is all those things. We believe that. But yeah, it's a tricky one. But the way I understand it, and I understood that reading, is that there is the limitations that God puts on himself in Jesus, in the incarnation, and in willingly, the theological term is kenosis, which is Greek for emptying. He empties his divine form into Jesus and sort of dials down what all he is, so humanity can get our head around it. Like one instance where this happens is when he appears in the Old Testament to Elijah, who has to hide in the rock, so he only sees his face, he only sees his back and doesn't see his face. And also Moses, when he comes down, is veiled because his glory is so much that the Israelites just physically can't handle it. In my dissertation, you're asking me a nice question about my master's now. I wrote about how there's a German theologian, cis-German, called Karl Barth. He talks about the security of the kenotic God, which is that only a God who's really secure in his own ego will willingly limit himself for us. So it's a choice that he does to make himself understandable and to make himself relatable to us.
Amazing. Yeah, love that. Okay, so next question. How do we get over the division that the word disability raises in many folks' thinking? None of us is perfect, so don't we all have some disability, great or small? So let's remove the division, surely. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. And you're right, none of us are perfect, and we do all have things that disable us in that they hold us back. And I fully endorse the let's remove the division message. And I noticed at the Mentimeter at the beginning, someone pointed out there's a check in them about the dis at the beginning of disability, which it's a negative prefix, isn't it? So it makes it a negative thing, and I totally get that. We all have issues, we all have problems, we all have things that we struggle with. However, there are in the Equality Act, for instance, the definition of disability, physical or mental, is I can't remember the noun they use. I think it's the condition or situation, a condition or a feature which has an effect on the individual as to make day-to-day life difficult at times, and it needs to go on for, I think it's for more than 2 weeks. And I mean, we all have difficulties that go on for more than 2 weeks, but things like, being nervous before an exam is not necessarily the same as having a lifelong chronic anxiety disorder. So I think the difference is in the scale and in how much it affects day-to-day life and how easily you can get around. And I'm very aware that I might feel disabled by my mental health sometimes, but I've got 2 legs that work and I can get around much more easily than my parents could, or than lots of my disabled friends can. So there are cases where we need to support people. There are people who need more support than others to get their daily lives done. But I see what you're saying about disability being not always a helpful word. That's a good point.
Yeah. Someone in the chat offering that maybe kind of we all experience illness, but not everyone experiences disability. There is sort of distinctions to the term and to the lived experience that comes with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another kind of theological question. How do we look at disability theologically? So the karma, for example, of the pantheistic worlds would suggest that it could be as the result of a previous life, obviously not a kind of the position that a Christian theologian would take, but that is a theological view that's out there. So how would you look at that?
Yeah, well, that is a view that people have, definitely. I'm not an expert in other religions, so I wouldn't be able to. I know that is a theory that people would have, but I wouldn't be able to comment on that more from the inside. As Christians, and I think the Jews and Muslims, I think, as the other Abrahamic faiths, would say the same. Brilliantly, actually, Jesus. So there's the story where Jesus is asked who sinned. So Jesus meets a blind man, and people say, who sinned that he was born blind? Was it, if he was born from birth, was it his parents' fault of his sin? And Jesus says, absolutely not. And he was born this way so the glory of God would be shown in him. I find that quite difficult, that the thought that we suffer for God's glory. I totally get that our suffering can show God's glory, but suffering for the purpose of God's glory I find quite tricky. But I would say absolutely not that the Bible the Bible and Christian theology as a whole would refute the notion of reincarnation, but also of it's sort of inherited sin in that way. The only time the Bible really talks about generational sin is more about relational issues being passed down from former families, which is something which is a really useful metaphor, I find, for thinking about how issues that get passed down in the family through relationships, like when you see people sort of living out the patterns of their parents in a negative way. I find that a very helpful way to understand that. Last one from Mentimeter that I've got for now, and there's also one or two that have come through on the Zoom chat that we can look at. So I noticed that the list of impairments listed in Leviticus 21 makes no reference at all to learning disability. Can it be that we see as a disability or impairment something which God doesn't view in that way? Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that is possible. And I think it's the Tom Reynolds and also this the Sinton in the readings. I think that's really it could be slightly sort of romantic in a way, but I do find it really interesting to think, gosh, I might look at someone who is profoundly intellectually disabled and think, oh dear, they can't speak, they're disabled, and sort of, but in God's eyes they are as able and as living out themselves and as fully themselves as I am. And the risk of that kind of thinking, I think, is that we then think, oh well, there's nothing wrong with them, it's all fine, it's all, they don't need any help. And as a carer, that is, I would find that, I think we can go too far in that. I also read a really interesting article some time ago, talking about ADHD and ADD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and then attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity. And this sociologist was positing that those kind of neurological differences evolved to help us when we were living in tribes, sort of Neolithic man, and people who have what we would see nowadays as very short attention span would be gatekeepers, and that they could scan the horizon and see things a lot better than what most people, so neurotypical, would notice. So there is definitely, I think, a way of seeing that that God wouldn't see a learning disability as an impairment or as a disability, for sure. And there's definitely also, as we know, a good society, everyone of all abilities or otherwise has a role to play and something to contribute.
Yeah. There's been lots more questions that have come through, and we could go for a while, I'm sure, but I'm just a couple here, which this is one that I think came up in a couple of questions, so it's clearly poignant. Interdependence needs to be both ways. Giving helps disabled people to feel valued. So how do we help the non-disabled church to receive love from disabled people and be willing to not be in control?
Yeah, good question. I'd say listen to the disabled people that you have, and to their carers if they have carers, and embrace, I was going to say messy church, but that's not even what I mean. Embrace the extraordinary and embrace something that's a church and a Sunday service that looks different to what you're used to. I would sort of in the sort of specifics, I would in that situation encourage the leaders in that church to spend time with the disabled people that they want to be learning from. Listen to what they love, listen to their passions, listen to what drives them and what they feel able to bring, and then let them do it with guidelines and sort of backup plans if that's needed, if that's the kind of situation where that will be appropriate. But yeah, willing not to be in control in church, I hear, is hard. I hear that's difficult from lots of sides, so I think it's probably a bit of heart examining as well, looking at why we need to be in control and why we need church to be perfect and to look. I think we worry a lot about being a good witness, and we don't always know what being a good witness means. I think the world is a lot more attractive to authenticity and vulnerability than shiny, perfect, happy people on a Sunday morning. So yeah, I absolutely agree that interdependence does need to be both ways. Otherwise, it's not interdependent; it's just dependence. And definitely asking disabled people what they can bring, what they would like to bring, and listening to that, and then running with it.
Yeah, that's good. And yeah, it refers back to what you said before about how the kind of interdependency that is reflected there in the church then also points to the interdependency within the Trinity, within God Himself. And on a very practical level as well, there's a question that came in earlier that also had some suggestions of, it was a question, how can the church respond? And I'm not sure if that was meant rhetorically or as a question, but a suggestion here was have disabled people at every level. So look at maybe who's in the positions of leadership within the church as well, and that being a way that, so in a sense, literally not being in control, because the positions of leadership are occupied by those living with disabilities, being a way to go about doing this. And then I think probably a famously thorny one to finish, and then we will let you off the hook. So how should we approach prayer for healing in the context of people with disabilities?
Yes, this is a thorny one. Ask them always and ask, and hopefully if you are the kind of person who prays for people and who offers prayer for physical or emotional healing, hopefully if you have that kind of pastoral ministry, then you will be kind and gentle enough to ask first and not be offended if they say no. I always think people often say, oh, I wanted prayer for this thing, and I wanted prayer for my physical healing for a broken arm, but God didn't heal that, but he healed my need for it, and that was the greater. I always find that a bit of a cop-out when people say, oh, but the internal healing, that was the really hard thing, because you can also have internal healing through counseling and therapy and medication and self-care. So but also I appreciate that which is not to dismiss emotional healing at all, but I struggle with that as a phrase. I think always ask the person and phrase it in such a way that they feel comfortable to say no thank you, because for lots of people, for instance people with Down syndrome, maybe they will that there's nothing there that needs to be healed, and so in that case that will be really inappropriate, because it's be like saying, well, Matt, can I heal you of being a male? There's nothing, it's just a characteristic and it's fine. But then if they say yes for whatever it is, then all the usual guidance for praying well for people applies. I think, again, listening to God as much as possible, listening to how you feel the Spirit moving, listening exactly to what the person would like for prayer, would like for healing rather, and also I think the faithfulness in asking if that's what the person with disability wants to do. Then I think, as with any sort of cause for prayer, it's something we need to keep at if they want to. Like as with the man at the pool at Bethesda, I think it's really interesting that he was there for 38 years. 40 is normally quite a symbolic number in the Bible, with Jesus being in the wilderness for 40 days and nights, the Israelites also for 40 years. And so when he's healed after 38, it seems like there's a little reprieve. He almost did the whole thing, and then Jesus came. Unanswered prayer is one of the hardest questions, definitely, I think, and it's one that people ask me most of all. Gay marriage and unanswered prayer are what people ask me about, and unanswered prayer is devastating, and it can really, really rock you. So being willing to hold that and make space for that, and and then persist for as long as it takes, if that's what the person is after.